All right, well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Montshire Museum of Science. My name is Marco Staffney. We're so happy that everybody could join us this evening for our first Plus Talk, which is a talk series that we have that involves our special exhibition, Human Plus, Real Lives Plus Real Engineers. The exhibition tells compelling stories of engineers and users who design and use technologies to help themselves and others achieve their goals, from everyday routines to lifelong dreams. This evening's conversation focuses on the human part of Human Plus, or more precisely, how our human bodies evolved over time to allow us to walk on 2 feet. If you have toes, please wiggle them now. You might notice that your toes are wiggling in a shoe, and shoes are a technology that help protect or cushion our feet. When something happens to our legs or feet, we quickly realize how difficult it is to navigate our environment, and technology enhances our body's abilities. Without shoes, I don't think that I would want to walk home in the cold. In a video piece in the exhibition called Attempts, an artist and choreographer, Bill Shannon, discusses the intersection of our body and technology. He says, imagine an ancient human being running from a pack of wolves, then accidentally twisting her ankle. Unable to run any farther, she lies down on the forest floor and listens for the wolves approaching. Suddenly, she bolts upright and reaches out to an old, broken branch. She takes the branch under her arm and uses it to reach the safety of her tribe. She was the first human to use a crutch. Even now, in the 21st century, as we explore crutches as acrobatic tools, this imaginary story of the first crutch use is important. The message being, it is the human will that defines how tools are used, as opposed to the nature of the tool defining how humans behave. Now, imagine that you have lost a leg or a foot. What are the things that you would want to still do in your life that you currently do? Probably everything. Modern prosthetics help us to do that. So, are you a runner? The Flex Run with Nike Sole is an extremely lightweight and durable carbon fiber foot, and it's designed for distance running. The C-shape propels the runner forward and improves energy return. Are you a hiker? The Fusion Foot's bottom plates flex, bend, and touch, providing stability on uneven terrain. What if you need to go barefoot? The Jaipur leg and Jaipur Stanford knee were developed for use in India. The upper part of the leg is cast in plastic to perfectly fit the user. The foot can be worn with or without shoes, which allows worshippers to enter mosques and temples barefoot. Our feet are complicated structures. The C-leg is a microprocessor-controlled knee and shin system that is customized for each user. The C-leg automatically responds to the user's individual movements by taking measurements and making adjustments 50 times per second. Sounds incredibly advanced, but it's something that our human body has evolved to do without our noticing. So, with us today, we're very excited to talk more about evolution with Dr. Jeremy De Silva. Jeremy, or Jerry, is an associate professor of anthropology at Dartmouth College. He is a paleoanthropologist specializing in the locomotion of the first apes, hominids, and early human ancestors, hominins. His particular anatomical expertise, the human foot and ankle, has contributed to our understanding of the origins and evolution of upright walking in the human lineage. He has studied wild chimpanzees in western Uganda and early human fossils in museums throughout Eastern and South Africa. From 1998 to 2003, Jeremy worked as an educator at the Boston Museum of Science, high five here, all right, and continues to be passionate about science education. So without further ado, everybody, Jeremy De Silva.
Thank you, Marcos. I think better when I stand, so I'm going to be up here. Hopefully I don't fall off and twist an ankle and attacked by a pack of wolves. Right? What I'm going to talk about tonight, as Marcos mentioned, is our very strange locomotion. Humans are weird, right? Humans are very odd mammals when you think about us in the grand scheme of things. We have much larger brains than you would expect for a mammal of our size. We don't have much hair or fur, and that's kind of what defines mammals. We're kind of the naked ape. And Probably the strangest thing is how we move. There are no other mammals on Earth that habitually stride around on their extended hind limbs. It's a very, very strange way to move. And I study why, or the circumstances under which, bipedalism evolved. But what I want to focus on tonight are not the pros of bipedalism and the reason why bipedalism was successful or selected for in our lineage, but some of the consequences of having evolved bipedal locomotion, and the consequences that we feel every day when we get up and our back is killing us, or our knees are aching. And actually, before I came up here, I was hearing some of you talking about ligaments and pains that you're feeling, and Marcos and I were talking earlier about your knee your calf bothering you, and then I started talking about turf toe, and this is something we share with each other, these stories of our wounds, right, from being bipedal creatures. And again, that's really, really unusual to be bipedal, it's the bottom, right? Because in the mammalian world, we have animals, we have great locomotor diversity, right? Animals that fly, and mammals that swim and run and leap and swing and knuckle walk. But again, the only mammal that walks around its world on its hind legs is us. That's it. It's just us, and it's really, really odd. Now, when we do see other mammals moving around on their hind limbs, we get pretty excited about it. We take a video of it, and we post it on YouTube. Right?
Oh my God.
Like Faith the dog. This is a dog that lost its front limbs, and out of necessity, walks around on its hind limbs. And it's a wonderful story, right?
Oh my God.
So animals can learn to walk on two legs if they have to. They can be trained to move on two limbs. In the wild, sometimes we do see animals taking on a bipedal posture. Often this is in the context of feeding or in the context of vigilance, and this bear looking out and being intimidating, or perhaps this cat doing the same sort of thing. So we occasionally do see other animals on two legs, and it excites us, right? We get really interested in that. We laugh at it and we think it's neat. Because it's so unusual, right? When we see other primates, especially monkeys and apes moving on two legs, we get particularly excited about that. And we study the circumstances in which we do see this kind of locomotion happening in non-human primates, because it gives us some insight, perhaps, into what the selective advantages may have been in our early ancestors. Why are we bipedal? And some of the questions may be answered by studying the context of bipedalism in our closest living relatives, particularly the great apes. But again, bipedalism is very, very, very strange. It's singular. It seems to only exist in this mammal, right? And so we as scientists are very interested in the circumstances under which it evolved. We're interested in why it evolved, but we're also, in order to answer that question, have to address when it evolved and from what it evolved. Lots of questions that still elude really good answers. We do have fossils of some ancient members of our lineage that show the tantalizing hints of the beginnings of bipedalism. There's a skull from the country of Chad, this one here, the skull from the country of Chad that has a hole in the bottom of its skull where the spinal cord exits the skull right at the bottom, as you'd see in humans today, suggesting that this creature at 7 million years ago could have held itself at least in an upright posture. This femur from Kenya is from something that at least has some anatomies consistent with bipedal locomotion. Maybe not exactly like you and I walk, but at least in the direction of bipedality. This incredible skeleton from Ethiopia, it's 4.5 million years old, of a creature called an Ardipithecus, has anatomies of its pelvis and the outside of its foot, suggestive of bipedal locomotion, at least occasionally. The earliest members of the genus Australopithecus, made famous by the Lucy skeleton, at 4 million years old, there's a shin bone, one of the oldest skeletal remains we have of this genus, and that shin bone is not that different from yours and mine. An expanded knee and an ankle joint that's a lot like what you would see in humans today. So we have very good evidence for at least the beginnings of bipedalism somewhere between 4 and 7 million years ago. And then we have even better evidence that this was refined and to some degree perfected by members of the genus Australopithecus. Lucy, shown here, especially from the waist down, excellent anatomies for bipedal locomotion. To her right, your left, is a skeleton known as Katanumu. Everyone knows about Lucy, but very few know that she had a boyfriend, Katanumu. He lived 400,000 years before she did, but we have a large male version of her species, Katanumu. That means big guy in the local language. It's a large male that also shows very clear adaptations for bipedal locomotion. And if that wasn't enough, the smoking gun are footprints. They left us footprints. Australopithecus walked through volcanic ash, wet volcanic ash, that was sort of like cement, wet cement, 3.7 million years ago, and left definitive evidence of bipedal locomotion in our ancestors 3.5 million years ago. Now we could talk tonight about the advantages of bipedalism. Why was bipedalism selected for? And the answer is we don't really know. There are two leading hypotheses. The first has to do with energetics, that moving on two legs is actually quite energetically beneficial and not very costly in humans compared to animals that move on all fours. We're sort of the Priuses of the animal world. We don't use much gas when we move from point A to point B. Other animals out there moving on all fours are kind of the gas guzzlers. So it may have been selectively advantageous for our ancestors to move this way because they could save energy, particularly in times where there wasn't much food. Another potential advantage is that it frees up the hands, that this isn't about locomotion at all, it's about freeing up the hands for carrying things, carrying babies, carrying tools, and perhaps even carrying food to share with members of the group, which may have increased mating opportunities for the early members of our lineage. But what I want to focus on tonight are not the advantages of bipedalism, but the costs. Because there's never a free lunch in evolution. There are always trade-offs. And if you evolve one thing, it comes at the expense of something else. And the fact that we have evolved this bipedal anatomy from ape ancestors, okay, that there's been a tinkering or a modification of the ape skeleton into this, it comes with costs. It comes with consequences. One of those is that we are slow. We are an exceptionally slow animal moving on two legs rather than on all fours. We're not very stable when you only have a platform of two structures rather than 3 or 4. And finally, what I'll focus on for the remainder of the talk is our risk of injury, given that we are an upright walking ape. I'll start with our speed and how slow we are. And to do that, I'll have this video here of Usain Bolt, the fastest human being on Earth. This guy is absolutely incredible, and his name is Bolt, which is awesome, right? And we'll see him in the Olympics this year taking home lots more gold. That is the fastest human being on the planet. Okay, he could outrun any of us, but he couldn't outrun a rabbit. Humans are exceptionally slow animals. Even the fastest member of our species, is slow compared to the rest of the mammalian world. We're also incredibly unstable. And the way I want to present this is the same way I do with my classes. When I talk to my students and say, okay, imagine that this was a woodshop class or something like that. The task was for you to build me a bar stool. I want you to build me a bar stool so I can have it home. The students who did something like that would get an A, right? Nice stable bar stool. Every once in a while, I'd have a student that would do something like that, a 3-legged bar stool, and that would be stable as well and would be fine. Anyone who built the stool out of 2 legs would probably fail, because I would sit on it and I would topple right over. Humans fall all the time. We're one of the only animals that just spontaneously bites the dust, right? Nothing caused that guy to, you just fell. When's the last time you saw a squirrel just fall on its face? They don't, right? Animals that move on all fours are very stable. And yet here we are, propped up on just our hind legs, okay? We are an unstable animal. Now, I'm not saying we should go back to being quadrupeds. That is not what I'm arguing today. I'm not saying that in some Orwellian way that, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, that we should be walking around out of here on 4 legs. That's not what I'm advocating. What I am suggesting is that, of course, there are consequences for the fact that we are a bipedal ape. And I want to dive into those now. I'm going to talk about the spine, I'm going to talk about the pelvis, and then I'm going to end with a discussion of the foot anatomy and how our foot is an absolute nightmare. But I'm going to start with the spine. Our relatives, our ape relatives, like this gorilla here, sorry, let me go back. This gorilla here has a horizontal spine. Okay, it's sort of like a suspension bridge, with all the guts hanging down from this spine. What has happened over evolutionary time is that the spine has become vertical. And we have 24 individual parts to that spine, 24 vertebrae. A colleague of mine, Bruce Latimer, refers to this as 24 cups and saucers balanced on top of one another. Okay? Now, my kids know, my 5-year-olds know, that if I was going to task them with stacking 24 blocks on top of each other, the last thing they would want to do is introduce a curve into the system. Because if they introduce a curve, the whole thing is going to come toppling down. And that's exactly what's happened in the human spine, is we have this S-shaped spine, this curve. Now, as I'll say in a moment, as I'll sort of point out in a moment, this is an absolute requirement. This is a necessity to have this curve. We have to have this curve. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. But having that curve leads to problems. That by having these curves in the spine, every time there's a flexion point in the curve, it introduces the possibility of a fracture happening in those vertebrae. And humans are the only mammal that will spontaneously fracture its vertebrae. Okay? Just be standing there and the vertebra will begin to crush and fracture. And this happens over time, and as you get older, you begin to fracture those thoracic vertebrae and you start to get a little bit of a hunch in the back. And then you begin to walk with more of a hunch because, in part, because the front part of those vertebrae are beginning to get much shallower compared to the back part as they are getting these spontaneous compression fractures. This doesn't happen in other mammals because other mammals don't have their vertebrae stacked on top of each other the way we do. The other thing that can happen, of course, is that those vertebrae, like those cups and saucers, can sway from side to side. Humans are one of the only mammals known to develop scoliosis, a bending of the spine from side to side, as you see here. Even the skeleton here is of a very famous individual. Does anyone know what that is?
Richard III.
This is Richard III, exactly. The skeleton of Richard III, he was severely scoliotic. And so these bends in the spine lead to all sorts of problems. And I'm sure everyone here has thrown out their back at some point or had some sort of disc problem in their back. Everyone talks about this, and this is in part a result of us being a bipedal animal, having been tinkered through evolutionary processes from essentially an ape skeleton. So why do we have these curves? Why do we have that S shape in our spine? And we can look at the gorilla again to try to figure this out. So if we go back to this gorilla now, and you see this horizontal spine. Imagine if you just take the horizontal nature of this spine and turn it vertical. What you would do is take this sacrum and you'd point it straight down. If you point the sacrum and the tailbone back here straight down, you would block the birth canal, right? And that is an evolutionary game ender, right? Game over if you block the birth canal. Natural selection is going to end that immediately. So you have to keep the birth canal open. So how do you keep the birth canal open while taking what is a horizontal sacrum and then converting it into a vertical vertebral column? Is you introduce this curve in the lumbar region, the so-called small of the back. And then if you curve forward, you have to curve back, as you do in the thoracic region, and then you curve forward again in the cervical region, and you get your S-shaped spine. So this is all about childbirth. But that doesn't solve the problem, because childbirth introduces a whole new host of new problems, as anyone in here who's had a child knows. Compared to a chimpanzee, human birth is exceptionally challenging and exceptionally dangerous. On the left is the birth of a chimpanzee. This is the size of the chimpanzee head as it enters the inlet of its mother, the midplane, and the outlet. Plenty of space. Birth in a chimpanzee is relatively easy. Birth in a human is not. The human baby cannot enter the inlet facing forward the way a chimpanzee does because of the different shape of the birth canal of the mother. Instead, it has to enter facing either sideways or somewhat obliquely. It then reaches the midplane and hits new bony barriers, and it has to rotate. So the baby rotates and is now facing backwards. At the outlet, it has to rotate again to fit those shoulders through. And so there's a corkscrew process by which human birth unfolds, and it's exceptionally difficult. Now, you may look at this and say, well, it's because we have big heads. This is a recent evolutionary change having to do with our enlarged brain. And you're right about half of the equation. But the other half of the equation has to do with the size and shape of the mother's birth canal, the size and shape of the human pelvis. On the left is a chimpanzee pelvis, and on the right is a human pelvis. One of the more dramatic differences in the shapes of the bones compared to humans and our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees, is in the pelvis. We have a remarkably different pelvic structure. Our pelvis is short and squat compared to the pelvis of a chimpanzee. Chimpanzees have these, oh, let me go back again. Sorry, I keep doing that. Chimpanzees have these huge birth canals, okay, and big spaces here for attachments for muscles. Whereas in humans, because we're bipedal, we've had to lower the center of mass, and selection has favored those individuals who have a reduced distance between their lower limb joints, between this joint here, the sacroiliac joint, and the acetabulum or the hip joint. You want to reduce that distance. Well, if you reduce that distance, it's going to change the size and the shape of the birth canal. We also have hips that are short and squat and have wrapped around to the sides of our body. By having them on the sides of the body, they reorient the hip musculature so that we can stand on a single leg and not tip over. The muscles over here contract and they keep us upright. In chimpanzees, those muscles are in the back, so that when they contract those muscles, their leg goes out, which is effective when they're climbing trees. So bipedalism has resulted in the reorientation of the pelvis and the consequences for the entire birth process. So this is an MRI of the birth process. A baby being born as it has to move posteriorly towards the back of the birth canal, and then again it corkscrews through. It enters first from the side, rotates towards the back, and then there's a final rotation to get those shoulders out. It's one of the most acrobatic moves you will ever do in your life, is to be born. It's a remarkable process, but it is dangerous. And that danger comes in part because of the changes to the pelvis associated with bipedalism. Now, how far back does this go? Can we figure out by looking at the pelvis of Lucy, for instance, whether she too had a difficult birth? And I think the answer is yes. Shown here is the size of the baby's head in a chimpanzee relative to the size of the birth canal. Okay? Plenty of space. This is what it looks like in a human. The baby cannot be born facing forward, so it enters the birth canal from the side, as you can see here, but boy, there is no space whatsoever. We can look at the same thing in Lucy and in another early Australopithecus, a 2.5 million year old fossil from South Africa that's shown here. Could they be born like a chimpanzee? Absolutely not. They had to enter the birth canal facing the side, and there was probably some degree of rotation. And when you have rotational birth, there is a benefit to having assistants present in the form of midwives or doulas, or obstetricians. So some researchers have argued, and I think they're probably right, that midwifery is one of the oldest human professions and may go back as far as 3 million years ago. So we've talked about the back, then we've talked about the pelvis, and now let's get to the foot. We'll finish up with the foot. This is my area of study. And the foot, to me, is absolutely fascinating. The foot has 26 individual bones in it. In one of your feet, 26 bones. Times 2, because you have 2 feet, 52 bones, which means a quarter of your skeleton is made of foot bones. And the exact same thing is true about a chimpanzee's foot. They also have 26 bones in each foot. Bone for bone, you have the exact same bones that a chimpanzee does. Now, with that raw material, a chimpanzee's foot is incredibly mobile, and they can use it to grab onto things and to climb trees. The human foot, not so much. And in fact, the human foot has had to do essentially the opposite. It needs to be a stiff, rigid structure that can absorb the impact of hitting the ground, but then push off the ground as a propulsive lever. So we've had to modify this 8 foot to be a stiff, rigid structure, even though it comes with 26 individual little packets that have to be held together nice and tight. Now, in order to explore the human foot in a little more detail, I want to take the same approach that Marcos did in his introduction and look at some prosthetic designs. Look particularly at this blade-like structure that is in the exhibit and was made popular first by the South African sprinter Oscar Pistorius before he kind of took a turn for the worse. And now other folks, you see somewhat regularly having this kind of prosthetic design. And what I find fascinating about the prosthetics that are in the exhibit and about this blade design to this particular prosthetic is how different it is from the human foot. Remarkably different. It's made of one single rigid structure, okay, that's pliable and can absorb the impact of hitting the ground, stores elastic energy, and they can push off the ground as a propulsive lever. Whereas the human foot is made of 26 individual little packets that need to be held together in a rigid manner to do the same thing. Okay? And the question that I think we can ask ourselves is not why doesn't the prosthetic look more like the human foot, but why doesn't the human foot look more like the prosthetic? That seems like a much better so-called design. And we don't have to go very far into the natural world to find things that do look like that prosthetic. The limbs of horses, the limbs of deer, and in this particular case, what I'll bring up is the limb of an ostrich. The foot of an ostrich is not made of 26 bones, there are 7 bones. Most of the bones of the ankle and the sole of the foot have been fused together into a single structure called a tarsometatarsus. Instead of having muscles in the feet, they just have tendons. And so the muscles are way up here, and there are long stringy tendons that come down and serve the role of as elastic bands in absorbing energy and can push that animal off the ground. Ostriches can run 45 miles an hour, okay, much faster than even the fastest human being can. Now, why do ostriches have limbs like that and I don't? Well, we can look at the evolutionary history of ostriches. Ostriches are birds, and we know that birds have their ancestry back through a group of theropod dinosaurs. And their ancestors were bipedal, and their ancestors were bipedal. There is an unbroken chain of bipedalism that goes about 250 million years in the ostrich into the dinosaur lineage. Fine-tuning of this structure over 250 million years has given us this magnificent beast, right? What about humans? Well, we've only been bipedal for about 5 million years, compared to the 250 million years of this lineage. And our ancestors, were they bipedal? No, they were apes. And apes require mobility in their feet. A stiff, rigid foot wouldn't allow an animal to climb very well. And so we see mobility in the feet of modern monkeys and in modern apes, and then we can look back into the fossil record, and what we see is a highly mobile foot in some of the earliest primates, a highly mobile foot in some of the earliest apes, and a highly mobile foot in even some of the earliest members of our own lineage at 4.5 million years ago. If they were taking root up into the trees to avoid predators at night, as they likely were, they needed to maintain some mobility of that foot, and a stiff, rigid structure was not necessarily what selection was going to favor. So when selection did favor a stiff, rigid structure, how did it solve the problem? It solved the problem with the anatomical equivalent of duct tape and paper clips. Ligaments. Ligaments bind those bones together. Okay? Now, just as paper clips and duct tape can fail, if those are your solutions to a problem and you're jerry-rigging something in the house, so can these things. And we have ample evidence for this in the form of the foot problems that you see in the world today. If you haven't suffered from one of these yet, as you likely have, you will. Humans have a tendency to sprain their ankles terribly, plantar fasciitis, collapsed arches, bunions, shin splints, you name it. Podiatry is a billion-dollar global industry, right? We've got serious, serious foot problems. Now, you may look at this list and say, it's because we wear shoes. It's because we walk on sidewalks. It's if only we were out there barefoot, running along beaches and grassy hills, we would be just fine and free from these sorts of problems. Now, if that was true, then we shouldn't see these sorts of problems in our ancestors. There shouldn't be any fossils of things that suffer from these sorts of problems. And it turns out that the fossil record is littered with these sorts of problems. They have been with us since the origins of bipedalism. We have fossils from Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania of an individual that had a terrible high ankle sprain. We have an individual from Ethiopia, Lucy species, big guy, Kedanumu. He fractured his ankle when he was a kid. Fractured his ankle, and it healed. He continued to live. We have another fractured ankle of an individual from Kenya that's 2 million years old. Evidence of severe osteoarthritis in the foot from Olduvai Gorge, 2 million years old. Compression fracture that is healed. The calcaneus and talus have smashed into one another from an Australopithecus that lived in South Africa 2.5 million years ago. And condition known as hallux limitus in a big toe found in a cave site in South Africa about 2 million years old. And it's not just problems with the feet. We also have evidence of spinal injuries in lots of our fossils. Lucy had a spinal condition that's similar to one today called Sherman's disease. She also had a healed injury to her hip. There's a skeleton from South Africa that has severe osteoarthritis in the lumbar region of the spine. And then a Homo erectus skeleton from Kenya that has what we think is some sort of scoliosis of the spine as well. And so we've talked about challenges with childbirth. We've talked about all sorts of foot problems in our ancestors. And now we've got these spinal problems. Now, if any of these happen to us today, if I sprain my ankle really badly, or if I throw out my back, who do I go and see? I go and see a doctor, right? These guys, 2 million years ago, 3 million years ago, if they throw out their back, this is what they're likely to see, right? This area is littered with predators. And yet, what I said over and over again with these injuries is that they were healed. Healed ankle fracture, healed hip injury in Lucy. What we see in the fossil record is evidence that these individuals were able to overcome some of these injuries. And one of the things that I would argue is that just as humans today, one of the defining characteristics of humans today, we talked about this at the beginning, our big brains, our naked skin, our bipedalism, we also are one of the more remarkably compassionate, social, and empathetic animals out there. We take care of each other. When an individual is injured or is elderly or is sick, we don't leave them for dead. We generally take care of them. And I think this is something that has been with us for a long, long time. I don't think these individuals on these bad feet and these tough backs would have been able to survive the environment that they were living in unless other members of the group were helping out and were taking care of them. And so I think that these negative consequences of bipedalism actually can feed back into the discussion and be one of these really interesting promoters of the kinds of behavioral things that we see in humans today in the form of compassion and empathy. So the next time you do hurt your knee or injure your back, the next time your bunions are acting up, you could take the tact, you could take the approach of blaming evolution. You could say, you could curse your ancestors and say, I wish they weren't bipedal. But I take the other approach, and I thank my ancestors and say, well, if it wasn't for them, and if it wasn't for their ability to survive these kinds of conditions, if they didn't survive, if it wasn't for them, then we wouldn't be here. Thank you all very much.
So I have a couple of questions for Jerry that I'm going to ask, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions for this evening. So I really enjoyed how you tied back our human capacity for emotion, empathy, compassion, and that's very much what the exhibition is about upstairs, as well as what the rest of the talks are about, really creating a community of people who help out. So we do that through compassion, we do that through helping each other, but we're now seem to be tied to technology forever and ever, right? So our ancestors didn't have things like shoes and crutches and prosthetics, and we do now. So
Sure.
where do you think the future of our evolution is going to go now that we're intertwined with technology?
Yeah. So I think I take a different approach than I think a lot of people would on this, right? I think we've been intertwined with technology for a long time. We have fossil evidence with Australopithecus of them making and utilizing stone tool technology 3.5 million years ago. They were modifying their environment. They were modifying their world to suit their needs. Instead of biologically adapting to this challenging world, they were changing it and altering it and getting resources out of it 3.5 million years ago. And it led to their survival. And it led to this ratcheting effect of technology. So it starts with something really simple, of hitting a couple of rocks together and saying, ooh, this rock, I can now do something to my world and make it suit what I want a little bit better and allow me to survive a little bit better. And then with Homo erectus, you see something more advanced and a different kind of tool set. And then with Homo sapiens, it gets even more advanced. And I think this is a continuation, this sort of interdigitation of technology, of our our social kind of networking, this combination of things, I think this is just the modern manifestation of it. This has been going on, I think, for the last 3.5 million years. And it's just continuing on. Now it's entering, I think, this new realm as ratcheting effects do. We now have sort of entered this world where, right, we are now reliant on technology perhaps more than ever. But how that's going to feed back and alter our anatomy, I don't think anyone knows.
Well, let's imagine.
Okay.
So right now, so let's put our thinking caps on and think about, so currently we're navigating built environments, we're navigating the forest, or navigating things that we have been, this world that we've been given. So now we're thinking about going into space. We're thinking about living on Mars. We're thinking about interplanetary journeys. So, in space, you don't necessarily need feet, right? So where do you think, like, if you don't have gravity to weigh you down, what's the future of sort of anything beyond here?
This is sort of like WALL-E, right? They all turn into So the way I think about future evolution is that the way evolution works is it's about sex and death. That you're not going to have any anatomical changes unless it improves your sex life, and it's going to increase the number of offspring that you can pass on to the next generation, or if it prevents death somehow. And so when it comes to the foot, sometimes you hear about the little toe, and our little toe is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually it's going to be gone. And no, because having a little toe isn't going to allow you to, or not having a little toe isn't going to prevent you from getting eaten by anything. And certainly not having or having a little toe probably isn't going to allow you to have more successful mating opportunities. So it doesn't seem to, from an evolutionary standpoint, it's not clear that you would ever have any sort of major anatomical changes associated with anything that doesn't have a negative consequence in terms of getting eaten, or a negative consequence in terms of sort of reproductive potential. Having said that, though, what we see in these changing environments, because the human landscape is now more diverse than ever, and I think coinciding with that is a more diverse human anatomy than we've ever seen before. There are forms of the human foot now that are out there that exist that probably wouldn't have been able to exist 500,000 years ago, or even 1 million years ago. These things would have been so detrimental to the locomotion of the individual, they wouldn't have survived very well, and they would have been sort of cropped out. And what we're seeing in humans today is that this increase in variation, in anatomical variation, especially as it comes to this. You go into a new environment like space, and it's going to potentially increase even more, because it's not just what you inherit. There are also the external forces of things like gravity acting on these bones and altering the shape of them as a result of the forces of gravity and what you're doing as your muscles acting on those bones. So we often think of our anatomy as being something that you inherit, but it's both that and what you do with it, especially when you're a kid. So you stick someone up in space, and they could very well have an entirely different kind of foot anatomy. And that would be really cool, because then you'd be able to tease apart what you've inherited versus what you have done with the structure to give it the shape that it has. Does that make any sense? All right.
So doing with the structure of what it has, you're using that statement, have we started sort of an accelerated pathway in terms of evolution, like with our own foot, or because we can evolve ourselves using our mind, right? So I can say, okay, moving forward, we want the human species to only have 4 toes and not 5, and we can make a decision on that, right? So have we evolved ourselves or our feet like using current technology already? So has like the high-heeled shoe or the sports sneaker already started to change our foot in a much more rapid way than it did with our human ancestors?
Yeah, so shoe wearing is really interesting. You can detect in the fossil record when our ancestors started wearing shoes. Their toes change in robusticity. They actually get more gracile. So when you have thin and not very robust, not very able to deal with walking around on the ground barefoot. So we can see in the fossil record, we get these fossils, you know, of Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, and their toes are really bulky. And okay, that's cool. And then a couple of tens of thousands of years later, you get these different kinds of toes, and they're much thinner. And that is evidence that they are beginning to wear some sort of shoe. And we can tell that in humans today. There are still unshod populations today of humans. You compare them to a population like this, and their toes would look a little bit different. And so the technology that we use, as you're alluding to, there's no doubt it has altered our anatomy to some degree. Wearing high heels will change the calf. And so the calf muscle gets tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter in individuals who wear high heels. But that doesn't get passed on to the next generation. So it has to recycle itself again and again and again and again. And so if I did a little experiment with my kids, and I said, okay, you're going to wear shoes and you're not. And I have twins, so this would be a controlled experiment. This would be fun. I'm not going to do this. Yeah, right, I send one up in space. Then you would be able to see the alterations happening in their toe bones. You could MRI them every once in a while and see these alterations happening as they develop. But of course, when they have kids, then you're back to square one. Right. Yeah. So there's going to be, if there's not a genetic change, then there's not going to be any sort of, well, I mean, one of Darwin's principles is that this has to be inherited. That whatever change is happening has to be inheritable. And so the change has to be in the genome somewhere and then passed on to the next generation. Now, that's something that, of course, has to be on our minds as the technology develops.
Right. So it's very within our grasp of changing our own genetic makeup moving forward. So if you could change something about our foot, what would you change?
Well, so with the caveat, with the caveat being that if you change one thing, there's going to be a downstream effect, right? So if I alter something about my foot and make my foot more efficient at what it's doing, like give me an ostrich foot, right? So let's fuse all these bones together. Let's move the muscles further up. Give me nice tendinous insertions. Give me an ostrich foot. And if you gave me an ostrich foot, my knee would probably be an absolute mess. Because the knee has evolved in concert with this foot. And this foot with this knee with this hip, together all form a structure that's good enough to avoid being eaten by the leopard. Right? Because that really, evolution is not about creating perfection, it's about creating just good enough to avoid getting eaten. And so having said that as the caveat, right, then it seems to me that some of the problems associated with bipedalism has to do with the rolling that happens to the inside of the foot, something called pronation. So when you hit your foot on the ground, you roll to the inside. Now you're twisting your tibia, you're twisting your knee, you're twisting your hip, and things have to untwist. And walking is actually a really rotational kind of motion. So why not make the third toe the biggest one? Just have it centered. Make the third toe the biggest, knock off the others, right? Or reduce the others, and have 1 and 5 be pulled back and be reduced. And then you can walk in much more of a deer or horse or ostrich-like manner. Now, I think the reason that the big toe is the biggest is because in chimpanzees, it's the biggest. In gorillas, it's the biggest. They're using it to grasp. And the other thing that's important to recognize and sort of, well, let's just knock off the little toe, or let's just reduce the big toe, is that genetically, your feet and your hands are connected. And so genes that are going to affect the big toe affect the thumb. So if you now go in and manipulate the genes and say, I'm going to change that big toe and make it small, suddenly, right? And good luck using tools without your thumb.
But it's a beautiful thing that we find aesthetically pleasing, right? Because ballet dancers or people who dance are always very smooth and wear point shoes, where then the center of their foot actually becomes the center of the toe sort of moves to the center.
Yep.
So one last question.
They have foot problems, right?
What's that?
They have also
they do have
problems, right?
problems. Yeah. So one last question before we open up to the audience. So you were talking about all these sort of things that we've evolved that have really made it difficult for humans to give birth. Do guys just get off easy on this one? Are there things that
men or males have that are difficult because of the S-curve of the spine and the perils of bipedalism?
Yes. Men are much more likely, because of our bipedalism, to have inguinal hernias. And so during embryological development, the testes start way up in the abdomen and then migrate down in the first year of life, migrate down in the scrotum. It creates a weakness in the abdominal wall. And what can happen, if you're quadrupedal, you can still get an inguinal hernia, but it's not as likely as being a biped. Being a biped means your innards now are being pulled down that way. And they can be pulled right through that little loop and down into the scrotum. And so bipedal males are much more likely to develop inguinal hernias.
That's something to look forward to.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, all right. We have a question right over there. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I'm interested in locomotion and your work in Naledi in South Africa.
Yeah.
And your role there, and what are we likely to learn in your field out of Naledi?
So for those who don't know Naledi, there's a new discovery that was made in South Africa recently in a very difficult to get to cave chamber. So difficult to get to, it required a team of 6 scientists to squeeze through a gap in the rock that was about 7 inches wide. And these 6 women squeezed right through and got down into the chamber and discovered about 1,600 fossils of a new species of early human ancestor known as Homo Naledi. This is something we published on in September. And I've been working on its foot and its leg and its hip and its back, and it is stunningly human-like. This is a creature that had a brain about 1/3 of the size of ours. Its teeth were a lot like ours. Its shoulders were shrugged. Its shoulders were more ape-like. But from the hips down, it is very, very, very human-like. Long legs. Its foot looks a lot like ours. Not as arched as humans today. And the toes are a little more curved. Not like a chimpanzee's, but a little more curved than in humans today. So what we're trying to do is figure out, with curved toes like that, and with less of an arch, and there are other interesting anatomies, peculiar anatomies that we see in these skeletons, we're trying to put those together into one cohesive argument for how this thing may have been walking in a subtly different way than humans do today. And to do that, we need to work with physical therapists. Physical therapists kind of go head to toe through the skeleton and see how these different anatomies interact with each other, as we were talking about a second ago. And that's what we're going to do with these new skeletons.
Do you have a date as yet?
Nope.
You got a range? What's the range?
From yesterday to 5 million years ago.
Come on.
We don't have a date. I don't mean to be flippant about that. We don't know how long ago they lived. Yeah, we will know in the next couple of years. Yeah.
Since high heels and ballet shoes were brought up on the side of technology, in your opinion, what is the best technology we can use to support these feet, and what is the worst technology we can use to support those feet?
Yeah. So that's a good question. I mean, as Marcos was saying earlier, I too wouldn't walk home barefoot, from here tonight. And I'm not a I don't really practice what I preach very much. I grab whatever is sort of the cheapest shoe on the rack, and sometimes it's fine, and sometimes it's not. But this minimalist shoe movement I think has some weight to it. That if you are wearing the kind of shoe that promotes the development of your own internal musculature of your foot, then there can be positive consequences of that. I wouldn't recommend it for somebody who's been wearing a particular kind of shoe for a long period of time and then suddenly switch. And so that's what I think is the answer to your question. The best answer to your question is that the best technology is the one that fits for you, because there's tremendous variation, and doesn't give you any pain. If you have any pain in your feet because of what you're wearing, that's a bad technology that you're wearing, and you should change it, whatever it is. Now, your bad technology might be somebody else's good technology, right? Because everyone's feet are a little bit different. And a lot of this depends on the kind of footwear you were wearing as a kid, when your bones were actually developing, and when your foot was growing and developing. And if you suddenly change that and introduce something new to your foot and say, okay, no, use this and run on that, or you can have all these downstream consequences, both in the foot and then upwards into the knee and the hip and the lower back and all the way up. I mean, there are examples in the literature. These are a little controversial, but there are examples in literature of people having jaw pain, temporal mandibular jaw pain, because they overpronate. So you've got problems with the feet, and as you roll with the foot, the knee goes, the hip goes, the back goes, the neck goes, and the jaw goes. And your jaw's killing you, and you go to the dentist because your jaw's killing you, and the dentist, if they know this chain reaction, they say, go see your podiatrist. So it depends on, it really is about individualized medicine, I think, when it comes to the best foot gear for us.
Can I ask,
having options.
is there a particular period of time in footwear that's been worse for the human condition than others?
I don't know. I mean, what are my options here? I don't know. It's gonna be a
The
foot
last 100 years.
well.
The last 100 years.
Yeah, right. I'm not really sure. I don't know why go-go boots pop into my head, but probably because I can imagine they're quite uncomfortable to wear. But I mean, high heels are what your calf does when you're up in a high heel is sort of painful for me to watch and imagine. And what the calf does and how it retracts back and stiffens up. And that can have some long-term consequences in individuals that are always wearing a high heel shoe. Meanwhile, a work shoe that, like you're saying, comes to a point and all the toes are scrunched in there can have all sorts of problems too. Bunions are the leading cause of bunions is the shoe you're wearing. Although it can run in families too, so it's not just about the shoes.
Would you mind describing the shoes that you have on and telling us?
Like I said, I don't practice what I preach. I don't know anything about shoes. These shoes. What's the name of the company? I'm going blank now.
They're on the back of your shoe.
No, that's the. It just says American.
America.
These are American shoes. No, they're not. Oh, maybe they're Skechers.
They look like Skechers.
All right, so they're Skechers.
DSW.
Yeah. There was some of my research was being funded for some time by a shoe company, and then folks were horrified that I wasn't actually wearing their shoes. Okay. But I don't know. I wear the cheapest shoe on the rack.
Could you describe some of the technologies you use when you study these fragments and these bones? Do you use 3D printing? I mean, you talk
We do. Yeah. So some of it is really, still 19th century science, where we have a fossil in front of us, and we're looking at the shape of the bone, we're looking at muscle attachments and ligamentous insertions, and I'm describing what I see in the fossil. So I'm just using my eyes, I'm using a camera, I'm using a set of calipers that I can take precise measurements. But the science is changing pretty rapidly, and we now are I'm going to Africa in a couple weeks, and we're going to be bringing with us a 3D surface scanner that you can put a fossil down on a table, and with this scanner, you just hold a button and rotate the fossil. And within a couple of minutes, you've got a full 3D surface scan of the fossil at high resolution, which then I can come back here, and even though the fossil is still in Africa, I can have it on my screen, I can zoom in on it, rotate it, look at it, check my notes, make sure if I read my notes and say, oh, really? That was there? I can go back and look at this three-dimensional object, and then if I want to hold it in my hand, right, I can print it with a 3D printer. We also have in many of these museums now micro CT scanners, so you can look on the inside of the bone. So you can scan the whole bone and get a CAT scan of the bone and look on the inside to see what the internal bony structure looks like, the trabecular bone. So inside your joints you have this network of spongy bone, and that spongy bone to some degree orients itself in the direction of the line of force being imposed on the joint. And so what you can do with a fossil is you can then scan it, look on the inside, to see what this creature was doing. Was it a very mobile joint, and the joints are all, the spongy bone is all over the place, or was it a sort of a stereotypic loading of the joint like you see in something walking on two legs, where the impact is always in one sort of direction, and you can see the line of the trabecular struts. So that's another kind of technology we use. When we were working on footprint analysis, so one of the things that we've been doing in my lab is we'll get students to walk on pressure pads, and we produce a digital footprint. It's not too different from when you go to CVS and the Dr. Scholl's thing you stand on, and you can see your footprint, and it tells you what you know, orthopedics you need. It's very similar to that, and we can get these digital footprints. What we're then doing is MRIing those same students and isolating their bones and then printing out their bones. So you can have a printout of your own calcaneus. It's really cool to hold your own bone in your hand. But what the great thing about that is that what our science used to do is, measure gaits in people, but we don't know what anyone's bone looks like, right? And then you can go to a museum, you can study all these skeletons, but you don't know how many of those individuals walked, because they're all skeletonized already. And we finally have the technology to bridge that gap. And we can say, you walk in this way, and this is what your bones look like. And then this individual, you walk in a slightly different way, and this is what your bones look like. So if I only had your bones, I could tell that you're walking in a slightly different way. And that's what we have in the fossils. We just have the bones. So when we find the bones, we can then say, I know that shape. I've seen that shape before. It's in people who walk like that. And you can begin to form this narrative of the changes or even the variation in bipedal walking that happened in our ancestors.
Well, we have one last question to ask. Okay, we have a burning question right over there.
How many people in the world study what you study? Or maybe even more generally, and then specifically, you've got that line from the foot to the jaw or something.
Oh, sure. Yeah, right. So there are physical therapists everywhere, right? That understand that and know that connection.
I mean, with the
right. So the fossil record. So the number of us who study the foot fossils of early human ancestors, I would say it's about a dozen or so. That if a foot fossil gets found, if there's a colleague of mine who's out there in Ethiopia or out there in Kenya and digs up some ancient foot, there are probably about a dozen options that they could call a certain number of people to say, hey, I found this foot and I want you to work on it. Usually it's not one person though. So for instance, with this new discovery that we made in South Africa, 3 of the 12, or actually 4 of the 12, are working on this together. It's that extensive a discovery, there are that many fossils, and so there's plenty for us to do. So we're not competing with each other or anything like that. But yeah, I would say there are probably about a dozen of us in the world that do this particular kind of work.
And they differ from paleontologists looking at theropod footprints, so they're more...
Yeah. No, I don't think there are that
more
many.
stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there aren't many jobs out there. So it's not something I encourage people to go into. I mean, if you get trained in anatomy, there are more lucrative ways to. I'm reminded often of how much a podiatrist makes, and maybe my choices in life haven't been too wise. But I love what I do. So.
Good, and we loved having you here this evening. So thank you so much. When we give Jerry. Please come back next week where we're going to be working with a specialist in implants and thinking about, we talked about all this technology on the outside of our body. We're going to be talking about what happens when we add technology on the inside of our body with Dr. Michael Mayer next week, same time, same place. Thank you so much for coming this evening. We hope to see you back in the museum. If you haven't seen the Human Plus exhibition, it's open through May 8th. It's right upstairs in the museum, and we hope to see you again. Have a great night, everybody.